Hello, welcome to the Maya Toolbelt. This is Michael. So, like I mentioned in a previous video, I wanted to start talking about the Hypershade, looking at materials and things like that. I did do some brief texture and material videos in the past. Feel free to check that out. The introduction to materials video I did a while back is a little bit outdated now, simply because it was an earlier version of Maya, and the Hypershade has gone through a lot of changes in the last couple of versions of Maya. So the Hypershade you see in that video is very different than the current one. However, all the information talked about in there is pretty much all correct. Nothing that has changed when it comes to process. So it's just the Hypershade itself is new. So in this video, I thought we'd look at the actual Hypershade as it is now, Maya 2017. And I'm actually running, let's see, I think I'm running update 4. Yep, Maya 2017 update 4. Update 4 just came out recently. So I am right there at the most current version of Maya. So the Hypershade is the material editor that Maya ships with. Easiest way to get there really is to click this little blue circle button. It kind of looks like a pool ball. Click that, and then the Hypershade will open. So this is the Hypershade. And you can see here we have lots of different menus and things like that. Some things look familiar if you did see the previous video I made. We still have our browser here. We can see all of our materials and textures and so on that we have in our scene. We have our create area. Then we have our working area. This is the area that you use to actually do all the nitty-gritty work with materials. Over here we have the material viewer. If I click on the Lambert, you can see that this updates and it shows me what the material kind of looks like. And then below that we have the property editor, which is very, very similar to the attribute editor, but not quite the same, and I'll get to what the differences are in just a minute. So in the previous video, I did talk about how to create materials, how to edit them, how to assign them. All that information is still accurate, so I'm not going to necessarily go through that again, but I just kind of look through the Hypershade itself. Maya is very dockable, as you've noticed. One thing that's kind of annoying, actually, I might have to go through and figure out a way to turn that off, because every time we kind of mouse over one of these docking areas, it wants to say, oh, you want to dock the Hypershade here, and it kind of adds it into the UI of Maya, which I don't necessarily want to do, and pull that off. So I like the Hypershade to be separate. All right, here we go. But the Hypershade itself is also very, very dockable. Let me actually maximize the Hypershade. So here's my Hypershade just filling my view. Now, back in the old days, you didn't necessarily want to do this because you couldn't necessarily see your objects, you couldn't see your materials and all at the same time, and the attribute editor and all these different things, trying to just see everything with very limited screen real estate. With the Hypershade being so dockable, though, you can add in all these extra windows and things to help with your workflow. You can click and drag and resize all these different elements to give them as much room as you want. If you go up here to the window menu, there's also other things you could add in, for example, a viewport. If I click this, it gives me my Maya viewport, and I can add this in somewhere. Let's say I wanted to add it in, and as I mouse around, you can see how different areas will shift, getting ready to be added, getting this element ready to be added into the actual UI of the Hypershade. So let's say I put it right here. It fits in right there. I can kind of, again, rescale these different areas around. So now I have a view of my Maya scene right here built into the Hypershade. I don't have to have the Hypershade to the side while I work with my scene. My scene can literally be inside the Hypershade, which is very handy. Other things we can do, a window, we also can apply the UV editor, apply that in here as well. And you can also stack elements on top of each other. You can see here, I just stacked that right inside this same area, for example, and then I have tabs down here to switch between the two. So you can have different elements taking up the same spot, and you just switch between them as you work with them. Let's see, click and drag this thing, here we go. Pull it out of here, and I'll close it. Go back to window again. Same thing with like the graph editor. We have the attribute spreadsheets, the outliner, all sorts of things here we can open up and dock into the Hypershade. So let me close this. Just close that off. And all these little X's here you can see can close these different elements as well. So if, for example, you don't want this area down here, we can close these two things and shut those down. If I want to close this, I can get a really big work area, which some people like to do. Then you can just go back up here to Window and say Browser, and you get this back and dock it back where it was. Or you can go to Window, Create, and dock this back where it was. It's very easy to get back to the way it was. Another thing to look at here is the property editor. Like I said, it's very similar to the attribute editor. I have the Lambert one I have selected here, and you can see here I have the common material properties. We have color, transparency, and so on. However, it doesn't have all of the properties that you would typically see in the attribute editor. Let me actually turn off full screen here and open up the attribute editor. So here I have the Lambert one still selected. Here's the attribute editor of the Lambert one, which if you've dealt with materials at all, is very familiar. But you can see here I have color, transparency, so on, but also I have translucence and translucence depth and translucence focus and these things that are not listed here. So what the property editor actually is the attributes of the element you have selected that are the most commonly used. You don't have every element, you have the most commonly used elements. If you wanted to see every element, these two buttons here, if I click this first blue button here, it actually switches to the actual attribute editor. Click it again, it goes back to the property editor. If I click this button here, it actually breaks it off as its own window. So this first blue button here switches between the property editor and just the kind of truncated, most commonly used attributes, or the full attribute editor. So depending on which ones you want to see. The property editor does a pretty good job most of the time of having the most commonly used things, the things that you would really worry about or necessarily want to use. However, there's always those edge cases where if you want to use that translucence focus slider, for example, you would need to switch to the attribute editor elements. So up here we have our material viewer again, like we saw earlier, and you can switch here between different ways of viewing your material. For example, we have hardware material. We can switch it to say Arnold. The Arnold renderer is the new renderer in Maya 2017. That's replaced the older Mental Ray. You can change the kind of geometry you use to preview your material. For example, a teapot. You can Alt, left click and drag, and you can still kind of rotate this object around. Let me go back to hardware. It's a little bit more smooth. Like so. You can also choose a background. Let's say, for example, interior 1 neutral. And it will kind of light the teapot as that sort of background. Interior 2 neutral. It kind of lights that way. If I switch it to Arnold, you can actually see the image that's being used in the background. And Arnold is very pixelated at first, but it does update over time. If I left it there for a little while, all these little pixelated dots will go away as it completes the rendering of the material viewer's preview. So interesting things here. A lot of times the material viewer can be handy. It does, especially if you want to use Arnold, it's kind of slow. So I might recommend not really using this and instead using the actual Arnold renderer of your actual object to kind of see how it's updating. And again, if I want to bring that back, go to Windows, Material Viewer, and then just dock that back in here. So for the Hypershade, one thing I haven't really touched on in that earlier video, in the earlier video I talked mainly just about the basic common material properties of materials, but I do want to kind of touch on how materials are put together here in the work area. Here in the work area you do have tabs. You can click this little plus icon to make multiple working areas. I can right click and say close tab if I want to get rid of those. So you can work on multiple materials at once without cluttering up your work area here. So just for example, let's create a new material. Over here in the create window, you can choose the kind of material you want. On the left side, you have kind of a category section. So if, for example, I knew I wanted to use an Arnold material, I can click on the Arnold name and it will filter with all the Arnold related nodes. And if I want to go to a shader, for example, these are all the Arnold shaders or Arnold materials. And for example, there's AI standard surface. That's like your typical standard Arnold material. Or if I wanted to use a Maya material, I can click on the Maya button here. It sorts through all the Maya related things. However, there's lots of things in here. So let's say, for example, we go to surface, Maya surface category, and these are all the surface materials that Maya has. One of which is the blend. A blend, if I click it, will create the blend material. You can see it here in my browser window here. A new material has been made. You can see my material viewer is showing me that shiny blend material, and there's my property editor with all the most commonly used properties of the blend. And here's my blend material here itself in my work area. You can click and drag these elements around. This is the blend material right here. This is a shading engine, so to speak. This is kind of the power behind the blend. But anyway, here's your blend here. So we have all these different elements, and you see these little black and white checkered boxes next to each one. Those are the mapping buttons. Mapping. Term mapping an element or mapping an attribute is applying an image to that attribute to drive it or to control it. For example, if we were to apply an image to the color attribute of this material, it will take on that image's colors. For example, let me click the button. It opens up this create render node window. So what do you want to map to the color attribute of the blend? And there's lots of choices. You can map all sorts of things to the blend. Typically, and you can see here they're already highlighted by default, you're typically going to map a 2D texture, a 3D texture, environment textures, or other textures. So all textures. This is where you apply a texture to the material. If you want to apply a file that you've made in Photoshop or some other image editing application, you would use a file texture. So I'll click that here, file. And you see what happens in our work area. We now have this file node that's been attached to the color of this blend, and the file node has a placement utility node that attaches to it automatically. But these are the two main things we're looking at here is the file and then the blend. And right now the file is black because we have not specified a file to use. So if we click on this little folder button to browse to an image, let's just say, for example, I have this old texture file that I found on the internet. I did not make this. Let me full disclosure there. This is a texture of a character model. Let's say open. So now I've applied this image. You can see there's the file path to the color of the blend. And you can see here my teapot looks unusual now. So we can change this to, for example, this shader ball object, and you can see it applied to it. Now because this is a blend material, it's very shiny, we can of course change that if we don't want it to be a blend anymore, but just for the sake of demonstration purposes. So let me show you another way you can create nodes here in the work area. You can try to find it over here, but if you know the kind of node you want, for example, if I knew I wanted to make another file node to apply another texture, I can hit the tab button, the tab key on the keyboard. The tab key will bring up this search bar, and I can type in the word, for example, file, and it will bring up everything that's in this area related to files. So for example, I would know I want a file texture. I can select that and hit enter, and it makes a new file node without having to go find one or apply one. However, I didn't click on the map button. Remember, the first time I clicked on this little button over here to actually apply that file node to the color attribute. But this time I just created a file node without hitting that button. So how would I apply this file to an attribute of the blend? Well, first of all, let's find an image to use just for the sake of having something on here. Here's a character's face texture. This is found at the Wiki Human project. So feel free to web search the Wiki Human, and you'll find it there. But let's just use this for example. And let's say I wanted to replace the color, this file that's attached to the color here. I want to use this file instead. So let me zoom in actually. So here we have file 2. It has this character's face texture applied to it. And here we have file 1. What I can do here, we have out color. The out color, this is the color that the file is outputting. It's putting out color. You notice here the out color of this file The arrow is going from the out color to the color of the blend. So what we can do is drag like this, out from the out color a little circle, and then as I get to the material, you notice certain things gray out. Only certain things can be applied with other nodes. Not everything can just be applied with everything. However, I can click on drag to the color and let go, and you see what happens is it replaces the color of this first file with the second one. So now I have this face texture applied to the color of my blend. I do also have, for example, a specular map for this face texture that I have. Let me hit tab, make a new file, type in file, choose a file texture, just like I did before. I'm going to browse and find spec map. This is the specular map for this character's face. This is for applying to a specular attribute of a material. So I'm going to control the shininess of a material by using an image. So the out color of this file will go to the specular color of the material. I just applied it there, just like so. So you can see as I apply it and unapply it, you can see how the specular attributes of what's happening here change. So the specular color right here is being driven by this texture that I've applied to that area of the material. Now this texture over here I no longer need. I can just select these elements here and delete them with the delete key on my keyboard. You can move these around to kind of rearrange and get things looking the way you want them to. So there are other really complex things you can do with the Hypershade. For example, there are not just textures and materials, but there are also things called utility nodes. Over here on the left side under the Maya area we have utilities. Eventually my plan, long-term plan, is to have a video kind of going on each one of these and showing examples of how to use them. Down here under the Arnold section we also have utilities. These are Arnold utilities for the Arnold renderer system, and they all do different things, and the only real way I can recommend learning how they really work, aside from of course coming here to the Maya Toolbelt, is to do a Google search, like array mapper or the channels or clamp or whatever it might be. If you're not sure what it does, do a Google search and see what it does. Also, you can just make one. Let's just say, for example, I don't want to do it. Let's look for Remap. Here we go. Remap HSV. So Remap HSV. So what does that do? Well, let's make it. So I'm going to click it, Remap HSV, and it makes the Remap HSV node right here. So you can look at the box that it comes with here. We have an input. Everything on the left side are inputs, by the way, input color, and then we have outputs on the right, output color. So you can input color and then output color. So for example, let me bring this file over here. This is our face color texture we have, and we have Remap HSV. So with the Remap HSV node selected, for example, I have hue, saturation, and value. So Remap HSV means remapping hue, saturation, and value. So I can change the HSV values of something else to become something else. Okay, so for example, I can take this face texture, out color from the face texture to the Remap HSV input. Now you'll notice here I have two arrows now coming out of this file into two different things. You can map the same node, the same texture, the same material to multiple things. You can have the output of one node, this one, being the input of multiple nodes at the same time. Okay, you're not limited in that way. But let's just say I take the output of this Remap HSV and put it into the color of the blend. Now you can't have necessarily more than one input. Okay, you can have multiple outputs going out, but usually you only have one input coming in to one area of. Now you can have inputs coming into different elements like these, all these little dots, but usually you'll have one going to a single dot. So because I now have this in between, this Remap HSV, what I can do, let's see, what's a good example object here? The plane? No. How about we do the sphere, I guess. All right, so here, it looks weird, I know. So we have our Remap HSV. So I want to remap the hue, for example. The hue is the color of the texture. So if I click and drag this around, you can see the color of my texture up here changing using this kind of curve editor here. There's also saturation. If I wanted the texture to be more pale or more saturated, you see that? I can control that here without having to, for example, go into Photoshop, take this image I've made and changing the saturation in Photoshop and then updating this texture in Maya later. I can simply use this node here to change the saturation to be whatever I want it to be here in the Hypershade. That's just one example. The Remap HSV is also a value here. We can make the texture darker or lighter with using HSV values that you typically can find with any color swatch in Maya. So that's the Remap HSV node used as an example, a utility you can use to input the texture color and output a new saturation for that texture using this utility node. So Maya's Hypershade can become incredibly complex. I'm sure I can do a Google search and find example material networks. I'm sure I can do a Google search and find example shading networks I can show you that are just super complex with all sorts of things happening to get these interesting effects and results. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. I wanted to do this kind of relatively short video kind of introducing the Hypershade as it is today, kind of showing you some example workflows using this work area and applying textures and using utilities and different things you can do to the materials. If you want to see more about how to create materials and how to apply them to objects, please check out that original video. I'll put a link to that video if you look at the little eye icon in the upper right corner of this video. Thanks again for watching. If you have any questions or would like to see any utilities gone over sooner than later, please feel free to make those kinds of suggestions in the comments, and I really appreciate that. Thanks again for watching, and I will talk to you later.